of out of place. Well, let's record this. I feel a little out of place being the only speaker in this conference talking about Yiddish. So thank you for letting me in, and hopefully it will be worth your time. In his book, Dancing Bears, True Stories of People Nostalgic for Life Under Tyranny, 2014, Polish journalist Witold Zablowski travels across former communist countries, examining the lingering effects of totalitarianism on people's ability to be free. In order to reflect on the topic of freedom, Zablowski chooses to focus on the fate of tamed bears, who were, until the end of communism, and predominantly among Roma people, a staple of Eastern European popular entertainment. Bears were trained to dance to the sound of the drum, played by their owners, while being physically chained through rings in their noses. Since this ancient tradition is no longer legal in European Union countries, bears are being removed from their owners and sent to rehabilitation parks with the hope that they will be able to, in time, to return back to nature. However, as observed by Zablowski, the bears and their tamers are not able to fully be free. Even in their natural habitat, the bears still dance, standing on their toes to the sound of music, waiting impatiently for a reward. In search for dancing bears, Zablowski arrives in Smorgon, Belarus, once a world-famous center for bear taming. And I quote, "The most famous center was in Poland, the happiest barrack in the bear-keeping camp, here at a place called Smorgoni, nowadays Smarhon in Belarus. In the 18th century, Prince Karol Radziwiłł gave the gypsies a piece of land on which to build an academy for dancing bears. Anyone who had a bear and wanted it to learn tricks sent the animal off to Smorgoni to be educated. In this so-called academy, young male bears taming females was considered dishonorable, were brought from the surrounding forests to learn how to dance and make funny things, such as marching and saluting like soldiers. The academy was closed down by the Russian authorities during the uprising of 1830, but even to this day, the saying, 'you student of Smorgoni,' is used as an insult in Poland. Yet in order to tame the bear and break its free spirit, tamers made the bear stand on boiling coal. To avoid burning its paws, the bear had to start dancing. In this Bear, A Brief History, Bernd Brunner quotes A. Kremenetz, a careful observer of bear Russia, who repeated the story he heard from a professor in the so-called Bear University in Smorgon, a town between Vilna and Minsk, that the animals there were trained to do all kinds of tricks, dancing in couples, pushing baby carriages, and so on, before they underwent a final examination in front of a committee and were sold throughout the world. The small city of Smorgon, located in the Grodno Oblast in today's Belarus, was also the birthplace of the Yiddish poet and novelist Moshe Kulbak, 1896-1937, who in 1922 wrote a poem titled Asore Dibraye, The Ten Commandments, featuring a violent bear tamer ironically nicknamed the Ten Commandments. In 1897, when Kulbak was 1 year old, Smorgon was the home of a Jewish community of over 6,000 people and more than 70% of the population. Among its most notable dignitaries were Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak Kook, Rabbi Kook, Cantor Moshe Kusevitsky, poet Avrom Sutzkever, and Kulbak. It is not clear whether any of them was a bear tamer. Jewish Lithuania was mostly known for its yeshivas, Talmudic academies, but from what is known from Eastern European Jewish folklore is that Jewish men did have a special dance nicknamed Mayufes, where the court Jew had to dance in front of the poets, the Polish magnate, to the tune of the Sabbath song Mayafit, How Beautiful You Are, still in use today during the Friday night feast. Yiddish scholar Chone Shmeruk dates this humiliation ceremony back to 1763 and wrote that for Polish Jews, the Mayufes became an expression of forced humiliation and groveling adaptation to the expectations of Polish noblemen, and sometimes as explicit, despicable abuse of the Jew. This anti-Semitic tradition, dating back to the days of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, persisted, according to Shmerok, and was featured in Polish and Yiddish literature in the interwar period and even during the communist times. The term mayufes entered modern dictionaries as a term defining someone who grovels and humiliates themselves in front of someone in a position of power. With the rise of Jewish nationalistic ideologies in late 19th century Europe, the mayufes Jew or mayufesnik was a term reserved for a Jew who has no national dignity and who tries hard to hide his Jewish ancestry while hiding his Jewish characteristics. The mayufesnik is a passive, degenerate, and degraded, almost non-human who symbolizes all that is bad with Goles, the Jewish diaspora. In addition, in Rabbi Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg's fictional story from 1911 about the Spoler Zayde, the Hasidic master, with the help of Eliyahu Hanove, dances a Cossack dressed in bear skin in front of a poretz to save a Jewish arendar, leaseholder, who was late in payment. At the end of the story, written in Hebrew, the dancing tzaddik, a Hasidic master, violently attacks his non-Jewish competitor. In the Mayufes tradition, however, it is the Jew who is the one being tamed, and the poretz, the goy, the tamer. So where did the bear tamer, or Beren Treiber in Yiddish, in Kulbach's poem came from? Where did he come from? When and how did the Jew and the non-Jew change roles? In this Jewish bear tamer, Kulbach states that he was a relative of his grandfather, really a traditional Jew, like a rabbi, cantor, or tailor. It seems that this grotesque and fantastic yet folksy poem needs to be read on the backdrop of the aforementioned nationalistic discourse, both Zionist and diaspora nationalistic, termed in Yiddish doikait, here-ness. I will argue that in Asoret Dibraye, Kulbach negates nationalistic tendencies altogether, setting the scene for his return to Soviet Minsk, only to be executed by the authorities in 1937. The poem Asoret Dibraye was included in Kulbach's collected works, volume 2, published in Polish-ruled Vilna, where the poet lived at the time, teaching in the famed Real Gymnasie in 1929. The poem is part of a larger cycle titled Welfische Lieder, Wolf-style poems, where the poet examines the relationship between man and beast, nature and civilization, and more specifically between Jews and their natural habitat in Lithuania. In response to racial attacks that Jews do not organically belong in the European countryside, being predominantly urban dwellers, but also to Jewish attempts to prove the opposite, Kulbach puts the concept of starke Yidden, tough Jews, to the test. What happens when the Jew really resembles his human and beastly ecosystem and his non-Jewish rural neighbors? The poem is a short narrative poem, almost a ballad, consisting of 6 4-line rhymed stanzas, telling the grotesque story about the speaker's grandfather's relative, who was a bear tamer, possibly in pre-modern Lithuania. The name Lite, Lithuania, is mentioned in the final stanza, and I quote, Gehato der Seide a Korev, a Treiber von Bären, a Yid was fleckt machen Konzert auf die Große Jeriden. Der Bär fleckt der Korev bei Tag of die Ketten verschmieden. Bei Nacht fleckt der Tanzen mit ihm, bei der Schein von die Sternen. And the translation is by Leonard Wolf. My grandfather kinsman, a Jew who tamed bears, performed in the market towns. By day, his beast was confined in chains. At night, they danced under the stars. The word Treiber in Yiddish is better translated as a driver of animals. In the poem, the Jew is literally leading the already tamed bear from marketplace to marketplace. Taken metaphorically, the expression of Bertreiber means inchorous and brutal man who behaves and looks like a bear. The verb treiberen, in addition, is Yiddish for nikur, or the removal of the forbidden fats and sciatic nerve from the meat in order to make it kosher, as mentioned in Leviticus 7:23. In colloquial Yiddish, the verb came to mean beat, clobber, or torture. The bear treiber is in fact a brutal, violent man who gradually, as seen in the second stanza, resembled an old bear. Diknochi gehend bis dikni mit der Scharbe naglaten, an alte verschlumperter Kopf auf der Gufa harbaten, und das hat getrogen mit Fell und mit Schweiß wie a Chaie. The man was bald, with long bony hands to his knees. He was hunchbacked and scruffy and sweaty and old, and he stank of fur like a beast. Kulbak's speaker makes the point that this nameless brutish man, who is only marginally Jewish and in fact remotely human, is in fact a Yid, a Jew, as well as a relative, Korev, of his grandfather. However, though the entire poem is written in colloquial, folksy Yiddish, the speaker also distances himself from this uncivilized creature by calling this person, who he only heard legends about, a relative of his granddad and not a direct relative, as if the family is ashamed of him. The word korev also brings to mind the Yiddish idiom Reb Korev, which means a friend or sir, and not necessarily a blood relative. The cruelty of this distant relative is not revealed primarily in his treatment of the bear, who serves as life companion, source of income, and an occasional bodyguard, but in his mistreatment of other people, mostly women. The deadly and violent behavior gave him the nickname Asore Dibraye, when the Hebraic Asore, 10, serves as his first name, and Dibraye, commandments, serve as his family name. Yet the Aramaic rendition of the biblical Aseret HaDibrot alludes to the Passover song, a Seder song, Echad Mi Yodea, who knows Juan, which descends from 13th Midayah, attributes of God, characteristics, to an affirmation of God's authority. Ironically, but in line with the tradition of Yiddish familiar nicknames, the solitude bear driver is violating Jewish law and human law. If Passover is the holiday of freedom, the Asore Dibraye is in fact free as a bear. So instead of being spiritually and ethically elevated and en route to the promised land and redemption, Asore descends into one God, an isolated individual who doesn't share any social solidarity or ethical agency. In addition, the name Asore here resonates like Oser, forbidden by Jewish law. Further in the poem, the nickname becomes even more fitting when the poem describes the marital life of the bear driver turned bearish. Unlike real bears who live in matrimonial isolation, Asore had 12 wives, corresponding to the first 12 verses of Echad Mi Yodea, who he managed to outlive by beating them to death. And I quote, "Es seinen gestorben von Pein bei Asoren die Weiber, bei Nacht fleckt Oiston sei nacket und onheben schlogen. Dann hat sich gehört auf dem Dorf a verteierter Klogen und Chevre Kadische fleckt waschen die Blut von die Leiber." The burial society washed off the blood of 10's wives, who all died in great pain, for he stripped them naked and lashed them by night till their grief was heard by the town. Here, Asore's true character is revealed as a sexual predator who physically assaulted his wives until they died a horrible, painful death. This brings to mind another stereotype of Jewish provincial life in Eastern Europe, featured extensively in Yiddish and Hebrew shtetl literature, the one of the Katlen, a slaughterer, or more specifically, a husband who outlived several wives. He is encouraged, especially if he does not have any male heirs, to remarry, even at old age. A woman, Katlanis, on the other hand, had, and in accordance with Jewish law, is a woman who is prohibited from remarrying after being widowed 3 times. In Asore's case, not only that his true nature, worse than a real chaye, beast, did not prevent him from getting married Jewishly, but also did not raise any concern in the Jewish community of Lithuania, known for the pious legacy of the Vilner Gaon, the sage of Vilna, that gave it the nickname Yerushalayim Delite, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Kulbak's speaker makes it clear that what he thinks of this kehile, Jewish community, that ignored the screaming of the wives heard throughout the entire village, and only sent the Chevre Kadishe burial society to wash away the blood. lack of communal solidarity, domestic violence, degradation, and humiliation of women, and a tradition chained to its patriarchal, unjust, and cruel traditions are among the sharpest and most heartbreaking accusations of this anti-shtetl poem. It is refusing to be nostalgic to the world of the vanishing shtetl. In the penultimate stanza of the poem, it seems at first glance that finally Asore Dibraye was eventually rewarded. His 13th and last wife, who was known all over Lithuania as a vedme, a witch, gave him a baby girl and died of natural causes, described in the poem as Asore Dibraye ot ois getzapt stil ireyoren. For years, he drained his wife's strength. If Asore actively murdered his previous wives in his unexplained rage, the instinctual behavior of the uncivilized, this time he seems to have been content to the extent that this successful late marriage resulted in a baby that was born exactly a year after the traditional marriage ceremony, chuppah. But one needs to pay attention that this match made in heaven between a brutal bear driver and a famous witch ended up with the birth of a baby girl and not a male heir, a yoiresh. Not only that Asore will not have a son to say Kaddish, prayer for the dead, after him, he will also not have a male heir to pass on his cruel demeanor to future generations. In Kulbak's specific poetic imagination, the future of Jews depends on a reversal of Jewish patriarchal tradition, from male to female, from confinement and subordination to God to human freedom and sensitivity. In addition, since the wedding between the couple was done according to Jewish law and tradition, one may ask who arranged the marriage between a violent serial killer and a notorious witch. Not even once did the poem mention a rabbi or at least a matchmaker. One would speculate, therefore, that the wedding canopy, the chuppah, was a black one, a schwarze, evoking the ancient tradition of the Schwarze Chuppah, when the community married off in the cemetery and under a black canopy, the underprivileged, disabled, and outcast members of the community as a way to stop a plague. Kulbak exposes the real intention of this supposedly altruistic act and accuses the community of labeling women as witches. The Slavic word for witch, vedme, is used in the poem instead of the more common Hebraic machashefe, intensifying the exemption of Jewish women from Jewish tradition and marrying them off to abusive husbands. The most significant and alarming rhyme in the poem is the one comparing the witch's birthplace in Lite with her tragic end on a mite, a stretcher of a corpse. What is left from the Jewish cultural citadel, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, is death and decay. However, the poem does not conclude with lite, mite, but rather in an almost exact repetition of the opening stanza. Asore Dibraye is still dancing with his bear at night to the light of the stars, perhaps the great bear in the sky. The traumatic memory of an abusive bear tamer featured in this made-up modernist folk song is still very much alive, even when the world of the shtetl was rapidly vanishing. The poem was written right after the Russian Civil War of 1918-1921. The bear and his tamer turned bear are chained to each other during the day and are free to dance at night in the light of the stars. This ambiguous ending articulates, nevertheless, the challenges of total freedom and the ethical, psychological, and emotional dilemmas of the truly free. In conclusion, one of the most famous slogans of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, the Haskalah, was "Be a Jew at home and a man in the streets." In Moshe Kulbak's Asore Dibraye, this optimistic notion on the possibility of integrating Jewish ethical values with Europeans' ways of life resulted not only in freeing the Jew from the chains of Jewish religion, but also from a commitment to universal humanism, of which the Ten Commandments are the basis of. At the age of racism, social Darwinism, and nationalism, Jewish literature in Yiddish and Hebrew filled up with images of alternative, marginalized rough Jews, as a proof that diaspora Jews can free themselves from oppression and be redeemed as free, strong, and productive men. But it seems, as seen in Kulbach's poetry, also expressed growing antagonism towards it. Instead of yeshiva students, clergy, artisans, moneylenders, merchants, intellectuals, and housewives, termed Luftmenschen, underproductive elements, this literature featured alternative characters such as smugglers, tavern keepers, milkmen, and bullies. These Jews were supposed to organically and naturalistically belong to their rural surroundings, and more importantly, resemble their non-Jewish neighbors. As seen in Kulbach's poem, the bear tamer Asoret Dibraye may resemble his native Lithuania with its green forests and educated bears, but not necessarily its rooted Belarusian or Lithuanian peasants. In fact, he resembles another marginalized, hated, and nomadic population of Eastern Europe, the Tzigainer, or the Gypsies, Roma people, perhaps the wandering Jew of the anti-Semitic legend, cannot stop being a dancing bear, because when he becomes a bear tamer, he stops being Jewish and becomes his tormentor. Thank you.